500 cables sit on the floor of the world's oceans right now, and you have never seen one. You don't need to. Every message you've sent today, every transaction your bank cleared, every video call that connected without you thinking twice about how, it traveled through a fiber-optic line thinner than a garden hose, lying in darkness on the seabed, owned by a consortium you've never heard of, and defended by almost nothing at all. You already sense that the internet feels more fragile than it used to. You've noticed the headlines: a cable cut here, a Chinese vessel detained there, a Russian submarine spotted loitering somewhere it shouldn't be. You've filed these stories separately as isolated incidents. They are not isolated. They are reconnaissance for a single, slow-moving contest over the physical infrastructure that the entire digital world depends on, and almost nobody has assembled the full picture for you. Here is the pattern you've already noticed: cable damage events that get described every time as accidents. An anchor that happened to drag for kilometers in a dead straight line. A fishing vessel that happened to loiter for hours directly above a cable junction before losing engine power at the exact moment its anchor was down. Here is what naval analysts call this pattern: gray zone sabotage, deniable, plausible, and engineered specifically to sit below the threshold that would trigger a military response. Here is the last time a great power treated undersea cables as a legitimate front of covert conflict: the Cold War, when the United States physically tapped a Soviet cable for nearly a decade without Moscow ever finding out. And here is what that tells us about the present moment: this is not a new front. It is an old one, reopened, with better tools and higher stakes. The official narrative treats each cable incident as a discrete, almost mundane infrastructure failure, a maintenance story, not a strategic one. The real axis of this conflict is not what you've been told it is. It is not really about any single cable or any single cut. It is about which states have built the deep-sea capability to find, map, and sever the physical lines that 99% of the world's international internet traffic depends on, and which states haven't. Beneath the headlines, a different logic is operating: peacetime positioning for a conflict nobody wants to start, but everybody wants to be ready to win. You feel this every time your connection lags for no clear reason. You don't think about why. Most people don't. There are over 600 active or planned submarine cables stretched across more than 1.4 million kilometers of ocean floor, enough cable to circle the Earth roughly 35 times, and that network carries nearly all of the data that constitutes what you experience as the Internet. Satellites carry less than 0.5% of international traffic. The cloud, despite the name, sits at the bottom of the ocean. But the more consequential piece is this: 4 countries, Russia, China, the United States, and the United Kingdom, have built the specific combination of deep-sea military capability and demonstrated operational intent that separates theoretical vulnerability from credible threat. This is not a list of countries that could, in principle, damage a cable with a dragging anchor. Almost any country with a fishing fleet could do that, and does, by accident, roughly 100 to 200 times a year worldwide. This is a list of countries that have built dedicated military units, specialized vessels, and demonstrated precedent for finding cables on purpose and either tapping or severing them. Start with Russia, because Russia is the country that built an entire military directorate for this exact purpose. It's called GUGI, the main Directorate for Deep-Sea Research, and it is functionally separate from Russia's conventional navy. Pavel Luzin, an independent Russian military analyst, has described GUGI posture shifting over the past several years from defensive work, charting safe routes for Russia's own submarine fleet, installing underwater communication beacons, towards something more offensive: sabotage preparation. You don't need to take that characterization on faith. In 2026, UK Defence Secretary John Healey stood in front of cameras and said his government had tracked, in his words, every mile of a Russian deployment involving an Aquila-class attack submarine and two GUGI surveillance submarines moving through British waters for over a month. He said the GUGI vessels were specifically designed to survey underwater infrastructure during peacetime and sabotage it in conflict. That is not analyst speculation. That is a government defense minister describing, on the record, a foreign power's submarines loitering over his country's cable infrastructure with sabotage-capable equipment. Here is what that pattern actually produced in the Baltic Sea specifically. Since 2022, roughly 10 subsea cables connecting Baltic nations have been cut. 7 of those 10 cuts happened in a single 3-month window between November 2024 and January 2025. That clustering is not statistical noise. The Baltic is shallow, an average depth of around 180 feet, which means its cables sit close enough to the surface that an ordinary commercial anchor can reach them without any special equipment at all. Add to that roughly 4,000 ships passing through Baltic waters every single day, and you have a body of water where deniability is built into the geography itself. Nobody can prove, from a dragging anchor alone, whether a captain made a mistake or followed orders. And here is the texture of what it actually looks like to track this in real time. Royal Navy patrol boats, not the anti-submarine frigates they'd prefer to use, because Britain doesn't have enough of those, shadowing a Russian research vessel for weeks. A Royal Air Force P-8 Poseidon, logging over 450 flight hours, just monitoring one set of submarines. Sonobuoys dropped across hundreds of square miles of ocean, listening for an acoustic signature that might or might not ever surface again. This is the daily reality of a contest that almost never makes the news, because almost nothing visibly happens. The submarines loiter. The patrol planes circle. Nobody fires a shot. And that, according to Siddharth Kaushal, a maritime security expert at the Royal United Services Institute, is precisely the point. Russia spent 2022 and 2023 in what he calls a crouch, testing how NATO would respond, before becoming, in his words, more accepting of risk by late 2023 and early 2024. The deeper question, the one most coverage never reaches, is why a state would invest this heavily in a capability it has, so far, mostly held in reserve rather than used outright. The answer sits inside a concept strategists call coercive signaling. The value of a capability isn't only in using it, but in making sure your adversary knows, with certainty, that you could. NATO intelligence chief said as much in the summer of 2023, warning that Moscow might use cable sabotage specifically to punish countries arming Ukraine, not as a single decisive strike, but as ongoing leverage, a blade held visibly at the throat of every nation that depends on those cables for its banking system, its military communications, its hospitals. You should understand exactly what that leverage is worth before moving on, because the financial stakes are easy to state and rarely stated. Trillions of dollars in global transactions move through this cable network daily, not metaphorically, but as the literal mechanism by which interbank settlement systems, stock exchanges, and currency markets stay synchronized across time zones. When the Red Sea saw cable incidents in 2024, an estimated 25% of all data traffic between Europe and Asia was disrupted in a single stroke. That is not a regional inconvenience. That is a meaningful fraction of the commercial nervous system connecting two continents, degraded by damage to infrastructure most of the affected population didn't know existed. The 2008 cable breaks near Alexandria, Egypt, are the clearest historical proof of how concentrated this exposure can get. A handful of cuts, near a single choke point, knocked out meaningful internet access for tens of millions of people across Egypt, India, and Pakistan simultaneously, because so much east-west traffic funnels through that one narrow corridor near the Suez Canal. Egypt alone still carries something like 17% of the world's intercontinental internet traffic through that same corridor today. A handful of well-placed cuts in the right choke point does not require a sophisticated military. It requires knowing exactly where to look, and that is precisely the kind of seabed mapping GUGI and its Chinese counterparts have spent years quietly building. Now pivot to the second country, running an almost identical playbook in a completely different ocean, because the more revealing pattern here is how similar the tactics are despite the distance between them. China's pressure campaign sits not in the Baltic but around Taiwan, and the stakes are sharper because Taiwan depends on just 24 cables, 14 international, 10 domestic, for its entire connection to the outside world. That is a small enough number that a determined, coordinated effort to disable a handful of them could meaningfully isolate the island, undermining its banking system, military coordination, and emergency response, in the words of one analysis from the Global Taiwan Institute, all without firing a single shot. In February 2023, 2 cables serving Taiwan's outlying Matsu Islands were severed. 13,000 residents lost internet access for nearly 2 months. Taiwanese officials traced the damage to vessels connected to China, but stopped short, at the time, of calling it deliberate, because proving intent on the open ocean is extraordinarily difficult. That changed in 2025. In January, a Chinese-linked vessel, the Hong Tai 58, was caught loitering for hours directly above a cable connecting Taiwan to its Penghu Islands before its anchor dropped and the cable went dark. Taiwan's Coast Guard intercepted the ship. In June 2025, the captain, surnamed Wang, was sentenced to 3 years in prison, the first criminal conviction anywhere in the world for deliberately severing an undersea cable. That conviction matters far beyond the courtroom, because it establishes, for the first time, a legal precedent treating cable sabotage as prosecutable sabotage, rather than an unfortunate maritime accident. You can feel the deniability strategy operating here even after the conviction, because China's response was to reverse the accusation entirely, claiming in late 2025 that the vessel was actually controlled by Taiwanese nationals running a smuggling operation, not a Chinese sabotage mission. Whichever account you find more credible, notice what both versions share. Total ambiguity, manufactured on purpose, baked into the operational design from the start. Here is what historians and strategists call this specific approach: gray zone warfare, a term used to describe actions that inflict real strategic damage while remaining deliberately calibrated to fall below the threshold that would justify a conventional military response. Ho Chenghui, who runs Taiwan's Kuma Academy civil defense organization, put it plainly: this is not an isolated event. It's a pattern of testing the limits of international tolerance. And the engineering tells the same story the diplomacy does. Researchers at China's Lishui University have designed and patented an anchor-like device, explicitly built to sever cables at depths beyond what ordinary fishing activity reaches. Not a repurposed tool, but a purpose-built instrument, with documented sabotage-specific features that maritime security experts have reviewed directly. The historical parallel here is not abstract. John Mearsheimer, in The Tragedy of Great Power Politics 2001, argued that great powers operating under anarchy, without a higher authority to enforce rules between them, are compelled to maximize relative power wherever the opportunity allows, especially in domains an adversary cannot easily defend. Undersea cables are exactly that domain. They are vast, largely unmonitored, owned by private telecom consortia rather than navies, and physically indistinguishable, on sonar, from 1,000 miles of empty seabed. That is not a coincidence, of geography. It is a structural opportunity, and both Moscow and Beijing have built dedicated capability to exploit it. Here is the part that makes the vulnerability worse than it first appears. Even when damage is accidental, the system that's supposed to fix it is dangerously thin. Fewer than 60 specialized cable repair ships exist worldwide to service over 1.4 million kilometers of undersea infrastructure. After the 2006 earthquake off Taiwan severed 8 cables in multiple places, it took 11 repair ships a combined 49 days to restore full service, and that was a single, geographically concentrated, entirely accidental event. A coordinated campaign striking multiple choke points in different oceans simultaneously would overwhelm that repair fleet immediately, because the ships themselves are slow, few, and cannot be everywhere at once. This is the kind of capacity bottleneck that doesn't show up in any single incident report, but it is exactly the bottleneck a state running a deliberate, multi-site sabotage campaign would be counting on. The choke point logic itself is not new. It is one of the oldest patterns in maritime strategy, simply migrated underwater. In the 19th century, British telegraph companies deliberately routed undersea cables to avoid rival empires' territory, sometimes laying lines into China at night, specifically, because the government hadn't approved them. Controlling the physical routing of global communications was even then understood as a form of power independent of any single message those cables carried. The same logic is visible today in Western efforts to route new cable projects around